In this video, we'll be completing the painting of this eye that we started last week. If you want to learn how to paint this one, make sure you also check out the video from last week. That one I covered the color mixtures and all the preliminary stuff. The first thing that I want to do here is start working on this upper eyelid. I noticed that the right side of it just looks way too smooth from that dark paint. So I'm going to use my eraser and just start adding some texture into it. And I'm using a very light amount of pressure here, just small circular motions. And you can see when I finish here, it just adds some subtle texture into it and breaks up that airbrushed look. There's also a bright highlight on the left side of this upper eyelid because this is where the light source is coming from. And obviously, if the light source is on the left, that means the highlights are going to be on the left and the shadows are going to be off to the right. The highlights on the upper eyelid here are kind of like creases or folds on the skin. So I'm erasing these out in curves. I'm following the curve of the upper eyelid itself and then basically just drawing in a few parallel lines with this and just kind of overlapping them. And these highlights just end up looking like the raised areas on the skin, where the areas in between the darker parts look like the shadows. And I'll just go over this area a few times. And if you're doing this, don't worry about getting it too light because it's not really going to affect anything. Even if you erased out all the paint, it's so easy to just spray some back right over it to darken it up. So if you're scared that you might erase out too much paint, just remember that it's not a big deal. It's very, very easy to fix. The thing that you want to be careful of is not accidentally adding too much paint. If you spray too much, it's almost impossible to remove it. It just takes so much work with the eraser. And the other option to fix it would be to use an opaque color and spray over the top of it. But that introduces the blue shift and I don't want to deal with that in my painting. So I just like sticking with the eraser. I'm just going around the entire painting here with the eraser and cleaning up some areas. You'll see that I'm going into the sclera, which are the whites of the eyes, and just erasing out the brighter area. I'll do the same thing here in the tear duct to make sure I get out those bright specular highlights and then just erase around it just to clean up any darker areas in there. So let's start putting this eye into the portrait and start getting in some of the skin tones and skin textures just below the lower eyelid. For these lines or creases in the skin, I'm lining up my shield with my initial drawing and then just lightly spraying on the shield itself, just letting some of the overspray get onto the canvas, a small amount. This way I'll get a very thin line. I'm of course using the flesh tone here to spray this in, and you can see that I kind of sprayed it a bit messy. I sprayed some more paint in some different areas, some less in others. This way it just doesn't look too perfect. It doesn't look like a sterile straight line. It looks a bit more natural. Let's go down to this next crease underneath. Same thing, line up the shield and then just spray the smallest amount of paint. You definitely need to get your airbrush control down for this one and make sure when you focus the paint that you're focusing it on the shield itself. Let the overspray do the work for you. If you spray directly over the shield, the line is going to be very dark and it's also going to be very sharp. But if you spray on the shield, the overspray helps you out. And the reason that I put these lines in first on the blank canvas is because if you accidentally sprayed too much paint, you got it too dark, you could just switch over to your eraser, just make a pass or two over the top of it to lighten these up. It's so much easier to adjust a line like this if the canvas is blank underneath. If you had some skin tone down there, it's a bit more difficult. So I'm just using my airbrush now with that flesh tone in and trying to spray a light, even tone of this paint to start covering up that white canvas. Since this color is transparent, I could spray it right over those lines. Nothing's going to happen to them except they'll just get a little bit darker. This is a good time to use the skin texture template now that I have a small amount of paint down. I place this over an area where I want some texture, spray a very light amount of paint, and then I remove it to see what it looks like underneath. It's so important to spray light and go slow with this because if you spray too much, they're going to get too dark. It's going to look like freckles, and that's not what we want here. We want this to look like skin texture. So subtle is the key here. And of course, this step is not at all necessary. It's just something I like. I like to add some more texture into my paintings. I just kind of like the aesthetic of it. It just looks a bit cooler to me. It looks more like a natural skin tone or flesh tone rather than that overly smooth look that you get from the airbrush. So once that texture is down, go back to the airbrush freehand here and then just glaze some more of this flesh tone over the top of it. And I just focus some more paint on the darker areas. Once that paint is down, we have the dark areas or the shadows in. So now it's time to add the highlights. And for that, I'm using my eraser. And I'll speed through some of this because it's the same thing that we did before, just going around every area, looking at my reference constantly, trying to notice where I see some areas that are brighter. For example, the left side of the sclera still looks too dark to me, so I'm just coming around with small circular motions to lighten it up. As I'm erasing here, I'm trying to overlap these and then just pay attention to any areas in here that might still look a bit too dark. Sometimes when you erase, there's some areas that just don't get picked up and they look like little shadows. So if you overlap them and just kind of go over the area a few times, you can kind of blend everything smooth so that it doesn't look like eraser marks anymore. It just looks like a more natural highlight. I'll add some more of this paint underneath that lower eyelid to get in that shadow and then go right back over to the eraser, start adding in more highlights. So we have all this paint down with the airbrush, and what these are, like these lines and the skin texture, these are the shadows. And it's very important to remember that if there's a shadow anywhere in nature or in a photograph, there's always going to be a highlight next to it. Sometimes the highlights are very bright, like a specular highlight, and sometimes they're very subtle, very hard to notice. And since we know that the light source is over to the left, the shadows are going to be on the opposite side. So shadows are going to be on the right, and the highlights are going to be on the left. So with that in mind, I want to come around all these areas where I have shadows and add the corresponding highlight to the left of each one. I'm obviously looking at the reference photo to help me out, but I'm not copying it exactly. I'm just kind of using it as a guide. And I'm sure a bunch of you already noticed this, but the highlight is not just over to the left, it's also slightly above the subject. So for these textures or these wrinkles underneath the eye, I want to make sure that I have the highlight above each shadow. For this first shadow or this first line here, the highlight above it is very subtle because the lower eyelid is also kind of casting a shadow on it. So the highlight's there, but it's not that pronounced. Now this next one is a lot brighter, so I'm going to use more pressure here to erase this out. That's going to remove more paint, make it lighter. And when an area is lighter like this, it's going to give the illusion that it's protruding. It's kind of like sticking up from the skin texture itself. So a few passes over it with some more pressure is going to give me that brighter area that I'm looking for. And I'm also going to use my eraser here just to kind of make a few passes around this whole area of skin texture underneath the eye. For example, in this area right here, I'm starting on the right side using small circular motions and then just slowly working my way over to the left. This way, I'm just kind of overlapping these textures. And again, it's going to make it look much more like a large highlight rather than a bunch of scratched out small eraser marks. In the lower part of this painting, this shadow here is also going to need a highlight. So I'm going to erase it right out above it, just like I did before. As I move along down lower on this, there's this large area of highlight, kind of like a mass of light. So I want to make sure that I start erasing into this to add some texture. But to really make this pop out and kind of stand out, I need a darker area underneath it. So I'll go back to my airbrush and then just lightly spray a small glaze, a small dusting of paint underneath. That way we can darken it up and then go back over to the eraser and start blending it out. Start pulling out the highlight brighter and then just blending it into that shadow. And I'm going to speed through some of this because you get the idea. It's really that same process of going over it, lightening it up, adding some texture to it. You know, you don't really need to see me erase out for 10 minutes here. Just take your time, pay attention to the reference, and remember that it's not a bad thing if you erase out too much paint because you could always use your airbrush to darken it right back up. I'm going to add some larger, brighter highlights here underneath the eye just to make it look like there's some more texture there, like there's some larger pores or some bumps in the skin. So at this point, I would say that this is good enough. It looks like some skin texture. It works for the painting. So the next step is to start adding in some of the hairs, some of the eyelashes. I'm using a black colored pencil for this because I find it the easiest way to add in small, thin lines. And of course, this approach is not necessarily the correct one. It's just what I find the easiest for me. It works best for my painting style. But you may want to do this differently. Maybe you want to just paint these in with the airbrush, just do it freehand. You could use some shields or you could use a small paintbrush. I've used all those techniques and I just found this to be the most effective because for eyelashes, you want them really sharp. And an airbrush just gives a line that's a bit too soft for my liking. And shields and templates work very well. If you cut out small thin lines in it, it's just those are just kind of time consuming. I just feel like they're a bit too slow. I'm using a holbein artist colored pencil here, but any colored pencil will work just fine. I picked a few of these up at Blick Art Supply a while ago, and I've been liking this one over Prismacolor just because I notice it's a bit softer, so it's pretty easy to draw in some really dark thin lines. But any brand of black colored pencil will work just fine. Over the years, I've probably used all of them, and they all work great. When you're drawing in eyelashes, randomness is key, and it's a lot harder to do than it sounds. Our natural inclination and tendency is to line up things like eyelashes straight because we really like patterns. And of course, patterns exist in nature, but there's always a bit of randomness to it. It's never perfectly straight, like one eyelash lined up after another. So I took a screenshot of this part of the painting right now, and I opened it up in Photoshop. And this is just for a demonstration of a very, very common mistake. So I'm using my pen tablet here, and I'm sketching in some eyelashes. And I think this is a good example of what you might find yourself doing if you're just starting out. You can see that as I'm drawing these in, they're perfectly spaced and they just look kind of funny. They don't look realistic at all. It looks like a cartoon. That's because in nature, eyelashes don't look like this. They're a lot more messy and random. They overlap each other. They're never ever perfectly lined up. So what we have to do when we're painting is try to avoid this natural tendency to line everything up in a perfect pattern. And this involves attention, paying attention to what you're looking at, either your reference or whatever you're looking at from life, and then a technique of trying to add some randomness to it. So as I'm sketching these in, I'm constantly looking at the reference. If you look at my completed painting on the left side of the screen, look at those eyelashes. Look at the way that I drew them in, the angles I used, and the spacing between them. You'll see that they're really clumped up. It's actually kind of hard to see individual eyelashes in here. It's all kind of like one big mess. And that idea of some messiness in any painting is really important to get natural looking textures like eyelashes and of course something like skin texture. So if you look at the right side of the screen as I'm drawing these in, I like to start at the base of each eyelash. That's because when you draw with a colored pencil, it tends to be thickest where you start. And then as you draw it out, you just kind of lift up on it, use some less pressure, and you can get a thinner line. If you were using an airbrush to do this, some people may call that like a dagger stroke, where it's a little bit wider at the start and then thinner at the end. But it's the same thing in drawing or painting, where the stroke is just a little bit wider, heavier at the base, and thinner as it moves out. So let's speed through some of this because you don't need to see me draw every single eyelash. I think you get the idea here. Just make sure they overlap them. Try to work slow. Don't try to get this all in one shot. Just take your time and just work on one eyelash at a time. And as I'm sketching these in, I'll also go back to an area that I started on, maybe add a few more random ones in there. Again, just trying to break up that natural inclination or that natural tendency to add a pattern. For the eyelashes on the lower eyelid, I want to first use my eraser and go back over this again to pull out some of these highlights. If you look at my completed painting, you'll see that I do have some highlights here underneath the eyelashes, right at the end of this lower eyelid. That's where it's just slightly protruding. So I'll go back to this black colored pencil and start drawing these in just like I did on the upper eyelid. You may notice here that the lower eyelid has less eyelashes than the upper eyelid. And you'll see this on most portraits that you work on. Generally, there's less hairs here, but again, it's still going to have that randomness. Some of these hairs are going to overlap, and there's just not going to be a perfect pattern in them. The reason that I erased out those highlights underneath these eyelashes first is because once this black colored pencil is down on the canvas, it's very difficult to erase out. You could still do it, it's still possible, but it tends to smear rather than just erase out. So I recommend if you're going to be using the colored pencil, try to get in the texture that you need underneath it before you start adding in these lines. And the last thing we're going to need to do is add in the eyebrow, but you can see here, again, I'm just going back over an area that I worked on before, adding some paint down and erasing out some more texture. And when you go over areas over and over, you just get so much control because if you wanted, you could literally erase out almost all the paint and kind of just start all over again. So even though using an eraser for all your texture can be a bit time consuming, it's definitely worth it for me. For the eyebrow, I want to get some paint down first before I start adding in the actual hairs. So I'm going back to the flesh tone and just spraying in some paint, some more where some darker areas are and some less in the highlights. I'll erase out this highlight here where the bone kind of sticks out. This is called the supraorbital margin. And just like the lower eyelid, I want to get this texture in first because the eyebrow hairs are going to go on top of it. To get in the eyebrow, I'm going to start again with the black colored pencil. And I'm just going to start adding in a bunch of lines following the way that the hair flows. It's kind of going up over to the left and then it kind of just curves around down around the side of the eye. So even though I'm following that basic curve, I still need to add some randomness to these individual hairs. So what I like to do is start and stop in some different areas, try to make some of them wider, skinnier, shorter, longer, just playing around with all different types so it looks random. And then I'll just follow that same technique all the way around this entire brow ridge, adding some thinner ones at the top where the hair kind of fades out, and then some thicker ones in the middle. So now that I have these in, I'm sure you're looking at it and realizing this just doesn't look right. And the reason for that is because at this point, it just looks like a bunch of individual hairs where you can clearly see the separation between each of them. But when you look at a bunch of hairs together, like you see in an eyebrow, you're not actually seeing all the individual ones. Instead, you're seeing a mass or a block of value. So in this case, where the hair is kind of clumped together, I'm using my airbrush with some black paint, spraying this over the top. This way, it kind of blends those hairs together. So you're still seeing some of them, but mainly you're just seeing some darker areas within the eyebrow. So I'll just work my way around the eyebrow, adding some of this black paint, mainly into the center, because that's where the hairs are really concentrated. So that's where we're going to have the darkest shadows. And at this point, we're done. The only thing I'm going to add here is I'm going to work into this specular highlight and just add a reflection of some of those eyelashes on the upper eyelid, just kind of reflecting into that highlight. So that's it for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. And most importantly, I hope you learned something. This demo was a simple painting, but I think I got across pretty much all the techniques that I used. So hopefully it helps some of you guys out. And I wish you the best of luck copying this. I want to thank the generous support of the channel members that you see on the right side of the screen right now. These people truly help keep this channel going, and I personally cannot thank you guys enough. I want to say thank you to Zelda for last week's super thanks. That was very nice of you, and I really appreciate it, so thank you. And I also want to give a shout out and a welcome to the two newest channel members. That's PSI and Ari. So thank you guys and welcome. I will have a new members video coming up this next week, probably Tuesday or Wednesday. And of course, I'll be back here next Friday for a weekly video. Thank you everyone for watching. I'll see you back here next time.